Did the Trump administration manipulate wildfire science to promote the logging industry? An investigation in the Guardian newspaper says yes. This is Trump on Earth. I'm Julie Grant. Wildfires are part of the natural ecology, but they're getting worse in places like Australia and California. Death tolls have risen, so have the severity and frequency. Science and the California state government link wildfires with climate change and predict significant increases in the coming decades. But conservatives often insist that wildfires are happening because of environmental laws, which they say overzealously encourage forest conservation. Former Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke went as far as blaming what he calls environmental radicals for the California wildfires, saying they stopped forest management practices that could have prevented the fires.
And I will lay this on the foot of those environmental radicals that have prevented us from managing the forest for years. And you know what? This is on them.
And in a new twist to the narrative, the Trump administration is claiming that forest fires themselves are causing climate change. In a story published last month, two reporters at The Guardian reveal how Trump and his appointees, quote, blatantly manipulated wildfire science, as one source puts it, in order to promote logging. The story was co-authored by Emily Holden and Jimmy Tobias, and Jimmy joins us today. Hi, Jimmy.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So what do these emails say?
The emails basically showed political appointees at the Interior Department asking career scientists to gin up and generate numbers about carbon emissions from California wildfires in 2018. And they used the data to put out a press release that promoted a very specific narrative, basically saying, look, the fires in California put out as much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as electricity generation in the entire state. And because of this huge carbon footprint, we need to cut more trees so that the fires aren't as bad next time around. We need to remove trees and other debris so there's not as much fuel for the fires.
You've got to take care of the floors, the floors of the forests, very important. You look at other countries where they do it differently, and it's a whole different story. I was with the president of Finland, and he said, we have a much different, we're a forest nation. He called it a forest nation. And they spend a lot of time on raking and cleaning and doing things, and they don't have any problem. And when it is, it's a very small problem. So I know everybody's looking at that, to that end, and it's going to work out. It's going to work out well.
And basically what this argument did, it both downplayed the impact of fossil fuel emissions by making it seem like fires were as big of a contributor, and it created an argument that the administration used to call for more tree cutting on public lands across the country.
And Ryan was saying it's not a global warming thing, it's a management situation, and one of the elements that he talked about was the fact that we have fallen trees. And instead of removing those fallen trees, which get to be extremely combustible, instead of removing them, gently removing them, beautifully removing them, we leave them to burn and actually, in many cases, catch fire much easier than a healthy tree, a healthy growing tree. Could you just discuss that for a second?
Well, Mr. President, we import lumber in this country. And yet there are billions of board feet that are on the forest floor rotting. And whether you're a global warmist advocate or denier, it doesn't make a difference when you have rotting timber, when housing prices are going up, when a lot of Americans are right at that border of affording a house, and yet we are wasting billions of board feet for not being able to bring them to a local lumber mill.
Can you help us understand why the Trump administration has an interest in crafting a narrative like this, that forest protection efforts are responsible for wildfires?
The administration is very close to the timber industry. The timber industry has long made this argument that forest protections are responsible for wildfires, and if we want to tackle the wildfires that are, that occasionally ravage portions of the West, we need to cut a lot more timber. And the administration has bought that argument completely. In fact, not long after this press release came out, not long after these emails occurred, President Trump issued an executive order that used wildfires as a pretext to cut billions of more board feet of timber on public lands around the country. So that's really at the heart of this, I think, that this administration wants to promote more timber on behalf of the timber industry, and they're using wildfires as a pretext to do so.
The emails that we're talking about were written by, one political appointee in particular. How clear were they in their request to play up the CO2 numbers and call for logging as a solution?
Yeah, the emails are from a period in 2018, from about August to the late fall of 2018. And mostly what we see is the head of the U.S. Geological Survey, a person named James Riley, who's a political appointee, and he runs the USGS now. And he basically reached down and asked his career scientists to come up with emissions figures for these wildfires. And ultimately, he passed these figures on to higher political appointees at the agency in the Interior Department's press office, who then used these figures to create this press release. But James Riley, like many of the political appointees at the agency, James Riley is a former petroleum geologist and a former astronaut, actually, who was appointed to take the leadership at USGS by the Trump administration. These political appointees at the Interior Department have a long track record of promoting industry interests, of pushing policies that are favored by the industry. And they have a very close, the political appointees at the Interior Department as a whole have a very close relationship with the timber industry.
You mentioned James Riley, but who was he writing these emails to, and what kind of response was he getting from the people he was asking to gather this information?
He was asking career scientists at the agency, people who have worked there for a long time, who are nonpartisan, who are scientists. They had little choice but to provide him the data he wanted. And in asking for the data itself, that is not so much what was unusual. It was the way he asked and the purpose that the political appointees later put this data to.
Because they had a predetermined narrative for the science, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, in reading the emails as a whole, it's pretty apparent that they wanted to paint a very particular picture, one that they could use to promote logging and to downplay the carbon impacts of fossil fuel generation. And so, over the course of these emails, Mr. Riley keeps asking the political appointees for these numbers, and he uses a bunch of unfortunate phrases when he does so. He's asking the science to quote-unquote gin up emissions figures for him. He said the numbers would make a quote-unquote decent soundbite and a good, a quote-unquote good story. And so the way he's talking about these numbers, it comes off pretty clearly that they're using these things to kind of promote a story, to promote a narrative, to promote very particular policies by using USGS scientists as their foot soldiers and the data they generate as a sort of way to do so.
Is what they reported inaccurate?
Independent scientists we talked to had very varying opinions about it. One person we talked to thought the numbers were overstated and didn't align with field studies in post-burn forests in California. This one scientist said, they were an overestimate, and that he felt that they were a blatant manipulation, that they were a political manipulation of science. Other scientists didn't have so much trouble with the data itself, but felt that it was, that was pretty clear that the government was sort of cherry-picking data to promote its narrative. One scientist, a professor from Oregon State University, made the point that the way they framed the carbon emissions from the California wildfires made it pretty clear they were trying to cherry-pick the data. He said, for instance, that the comparison of fire to electrical emissions in California was not explained or justified. Picking other sectors would have left an entirely different image in the reader's mind. For example, the press release they put out compared the carbon emissions from California fires to electricity generation in California, saying that the fires contributed as much CO2 to the atmosphere as electricity generation in California. But on a national level, that's totally untrue. At a national level, wildfire carbon emissions make up just 1.7% of carbon emissions that are related to fossil fuels. So wildfires are a tiny drop in the bucket when it comes to carbon emissions, and yet this press release made it seem like they were on par with electricity generation. So it's just a very misleading way to present the data. And that's, I think, the overall takeaway, that they use this data, which may or may not have been an overestimate, to paint a very misleading picture to the public.
And just going back a little bit, is it normal, is it customary for the Interior Department to try to quantify emissions from fires?
Yeah, I mean, the USGS is a very revered, legitimate scientific agency, and they do all sorts of research, and they generate all sorts of data. So I think it's completely legitimate for them to want to know the carbon emissions from wildfires. But it's the way, and so the scientists here, they were just doing their jobs. It's the way that this data was deployed that raised a lot of questions.
And what does science say about the connection between fires and climate change?
The science certainly shows a link between climate change and both the severity and frequency of fires. But I'll also say that, wildfire is an essential feature of the American landscape. Many plants and animals rely on it to reproduce or for habitat and other things. And a big part of the problem is that the United States government, has spent the last century suppressing fires. And so there's a huge buildup of fuel in the forest that leads to the conditions that cause these huge fires. And at the same time, local governments have allowed people to build at the edge of forests, which puts them in danger. And then you add to those two things, the impacts of climate, and we're seeing a lot of severe fires in recent years. And so, it's certainly a mix of things that are contributing to these big fires we're seeing. There's a lot of powerful interests who are taking advantage of that to promote their own economic gain.
This email exchange, this incident happened while Ryan Zinke was still chief of the Department of the Interior. He has since left office, and David Barnhart has taken over that position. Would you expect anything different under this new leadership?
No, I wouldn't. The Secretary Bernhardt, he gets a lot less media coverage than Ryan Zinke, because Ryan Zinke was sort of a flamboyant figure, but he has pursued very similar policy goals, from rolling back the Endangered Species Act regulations to promoting fossil fuel drilling on the federal lands. And like Zinke before him, the agency under Mr. Bernhard has been plagued by ethics scandals. It's a very similar culture, although, it doesn't necessarily get as many headlines as it did under Zinke, who on his first day on the job, for instance, rode into office on a horse. So there's just like a little different kind of tone, but the policies are generally the same.
All right. Well, Jimmy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Jimmy Tobias is a reporter with the Guardian newspaper. His story, co-authored with Emily Holden, was published January 24th. Thanks for listening to Trump on Earth. If you like our show, please consider supporting us through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/TrumpOnEarth. You can find us online at TrumpOnEarth.org and anywhere you get your podcasts. Write us a review and tell your friends. The podcast is supported by the Robert F. Schuman Foundation. Our producer and digital editor is Andy Cubis. Kathy Nauer is the executive producer. I'm Julie Grant.